What we're going to talk about today is the Theory of Knowledge title for November 2020. The title that we're going to focus on is the questions we can ask depend more on what we already know than on what we do not know. Discuss this claim with reference to two areas of knowledge. What I'm going to take you through is my unpacking and a couple of suggestions for how you could approach this title. Before we begin the unpacking process in earnest, it's important to identify the key words and command terms that are evident in the title. A couple of key terms that I think that you should really start to investigate and start to analyze and really dig deep into could be questions, depend, already know, do not know, and discuss. Questions you can think about are wonderings, lines of inquiry. It could be the basis or the starting point for the development of knowledge. And you can think about, okay, well, how does knowledge actually tie into questions? Do we have this idea of informed questions, questions that are built from knowledge? And are these more credible, more reliable if asked? Dependence is this idea of reliance. It could be reliance on authority, on a particular hierarchy, and you can think about dependence being a spectrum. Some things we are more dependent on than others. Okay, dependence might change from person to person, from knower to knower. It depends on the type of thing that we are dependent upon as well. Are we more dependent on authority figures over people with less authority? There's some good starting points that you can begin to think about your analysis. You think about what we already know as our prior knowledge. It could be established, and it may not or may be opened to be reconsidered or reevaluated. You can think about things that you know as facts. What happens when you question those things that are core of what you already know? How does that make you feel? How does that questioning of knowledge, what does that mean to question those basic facts that you already know? Things that we do not know could be unknowns, and these are points of maybe exploration. And discuss means to offer a considered and balanced review that includes a range of arguments, factors, or hypotheses. So you need in your essay to be able to look at a variety of different perspectives and formulate an argument in relation to the title. Your argument needs to acknowledge claims and counterclaims and make sure that you have a balanced perspective. So you need to acknowledge that, okay, well, we may depend on things that we already know, but then we should also think about questioning the unknown as well. It depends on what type of argument you're going to create. Some knowledge questions that I came up with that could be potential further routes of exploration are listed on the screen. These are just some of the ones that I first thought of. There are many different knowledge questions you could create from this title, and this title really offers you a broad scope for things to start to think about. The knowledge processes is the areas of knowledge in which can help us to unpack the title. So for history, I thought about applying a historical lens to the title, and I came up with the idea of, okay, well, we have revision of historical interpretations. These are questioning things that we already know. These are historical accounts that have been developed by historians or by reliable sources. These are questioning and reevaluating things that we already know about the past. You can also think about at the beginning of the process in history, you require a baseline of knowledge. I can't, understand the Vietnam War without understanding the context of the time, without understanding the Cold War and, American foreign relations at the time. My question wouldn't be very good if I didn't have at least a base level of knowledge. So you do require some development of knowledge, okay, which drives the creation of different views. And you think about, okay, if I wanted to develop a complex question, more than just what happened, would I need more knowledge? And probably the answer you come into is maybe yes. And you can also think about, okay, well, if I just answer a question of what happened, am I actually doing history? Is answering what happened just a chronicle, just a narrative recounts of the past? Whereas history is trying to develop an interpretation, an analysis, and try to formulate an argument. So if I'm just trying to answer what happened, maybe that could be something that I don't already know. But if I want to do history, I need to have some knowledge. I need to have some things that I already know. For indigenous knowledge systems, the application of knowledge in utility, what we know has been passed down to us. The need to adapt knowledge, okay, to a new context. So this is the idea of, okay, well, the questions we can ask, okay, have been passed down to us. What is needed, what is relevant, and the purpose of asking questions. there needs to be the need for new knowledge. Okay, it needs to be contextualized. Okay, so we need to our knowledge that things that we already know have been passed down to us from elders, and this can help us to confirm or clarify and solve problems in the now. So it needs to be applied to the context. So it's applying something that we already know. So this is knowledge, and then questioning it of how it relates to what we don't know, being our current context. So this is a kind of a fusion in which we see elements of things that we already know being used as a stimulus to find out things that we don't know, okay, being applied to what we don't know. For the human sciences, you can think about, well, it mentions questions, and questions are a really core part of what the human sciences does. It's a part of the methodology, it's a part of their way of finding data. You think about problems with referendums, you've got a great example in Brexit. You can also go back and find an Australian example being the 1999 referendum in which the Republic was voted against. And you can think about some problems that are created in the human sciences as a result of questions. It could be confirmation, selection bias. Okay, you think about leading questions. You think about all the variety of different issues that questions create in the human sciences. And maybe it's good that these questions are born from things that we don't know, because we're less likely to be biased when developing these particular questions. In maths, you can think about axioms, okay, versus questions. Okay, does this lead to assumptions? An axiom is something that we in mathematics that is deemed to be true, and then has a mathematical proof. And is the format of questions important? Are axioms questions or are they not? And you think about the role in which language plays maybe in the development of questions. In the natural sciences, finally, you can talk about falsification. So this is the idea of looking for something that we do not necessarily know already. So questions still depend on the knowledge, but you're looking to prove against the question. And you think about the idea of trial and error. So this is something that we maybe do not know, and the idea of moving from correlation to causation through the use of trial and error. So we don't really necessarily have questions. So does it work? Doesn't it work? Okay, and these are questioning things that we don't know. And trial and error doesn't necessarily rely on too much on what we already know. So there's a variety of different areas of knowledge which you can use to investigate this particular title. In terms of the knowledge framework, I first had a look at looking at through the lens of scope and application. So the questions that are asked are dependent on the scope of the field. Questions that break fields, looking into things that we don't already know, or maybe this idea of interdisciplinary questions, this foray into the unknown. So the fusion of, say, history and the natural sciences, or this fusion of the human sciences and arts, okay? Do these things that we are built from knowledge in both areas, but then are questioning into this fusion between the two. You would need to find an RLS to kind of support that idea of interdisciplinary areas of knowledge and how questions are framed in such a way. You can also think about the legitimacy of questions, and this is governed by the scope. So asking a question in the natural sciences is going to be very different to how you ask a question in the human sciences, okay, because they have a different scope of what they are trying to look at. You can think about the benefit of hindsight, okay? So, for me, I'm very interested in sports. So if things that we don't know, say a player's value, okay, a player coming out of college, we don't know whether we should draft them in the top, okay, or at the bottom. How good is the player going to be? Is he going to be really good? Is he not going to be very good at all? Is he going to be a superstar in this particular sport? What we can do is, in the real life example that I've linked in here, you can think about the role of mathematics in assigning value. So this is one way in which general managers of sporting teams today try to use mathematics to look at things that we already know to try to project a player's value. So we can think about, okay, well, this is how many shots they made in college. This is how many touchdowns that they have made over the course. This is the most like comparison. This is the player that we need for our particular team. We need a player that does these particular statistical values. And statistics now, and basing on what we already know, has been the basis for answering a lot of questions about players' value. And you can also think about it in terms of economics, this idea of this balance between speculation and investing. Both begin with the same question of what will give me the greatest return on investment, but both depend on different evidence in order to develop their strategy. So you can think about that as an idea of how this could how questions apply in the human sciences. The knowledge framework, you can think about paradigm shifts. Okay, it's focused on answering what we don't know. These questions are formed on intuition and sense perception. And you need to think about maybe formalizing what is known. You can think about Johari's window. It's a good example to have a look at in terms of what does actually it mean for something to be known. Questions are obviously dependent on language and may lead to cyclical questioning. So if so, how do we craft deeper questions? So this is the idea of we keep asking the same continual questions because we're so dependent on the same language. And how can we frame questions that are more complex and looking at maybe the heart of the issue? We also need a baseline of knowledge to ask relevant questions, and you can think about the title really focuses on an idea of significance, and that is tied to this idea of dependence. So the importance of open dialogue and collaboration. If we were able to pull what people knew in terms of shared knowledge, would be able to develop better questions, is something that you could potentially investigate. You can also think about the idea of the spectrum of dependence. So how is questions dependent on what we already know seen in one area of knowledge, and then maybe how does that change into another area of knowledge, and looking at that comparative and contrasting there. Historical developments, okay, we know that knowledge develops in patterns, okay, correlation on what data we have and what we know from our experience. And we develop questions based on patterns, questions based on similarities rather than referring to something unknown. This could be based on because of discrimination or because of a fear of unknown. So this is the idea of, okay, in the historical developments, we have this idea of what we know develops over a period of time. And as a result, our questions become more and more and more complex. For the links to personal knowledge, obviously questions can be highly personal and dependent upon the questioner. Questions could be derived from personal and as a result are affected by context, interest, and background. And this could be a potential issue that you can look at with regards to the human sciences because they are focused on human behavior. If questions are developed and proposed by multiple people, are they more useful? This is the idea of drawing from shared knowledge, drawing from a pool of what we already know. This relies on the assumption that shared knowledge is more vast, authoritative, certain, and reliable than the personal. And think about this idea of personal imagination as a way of knowing may drive questions into the unknown. But are these still grounded in the unknown? Is the idea of sort of original imagination? Is imagination still born from things that we already know? Or can we just have raw imagination that is not drawn from anything that we already know? The perspectives that are evident in the title could be, who is the we? You could be looking at the different we's that we see in the world. So it could be personal, it could be shared, it could be the authority we, it could be the uneducated versus the educated, the knowledgeable versus the ignorant, the biased versus the unbiased. Does it matter who the person that is asking the question is? Is that necessarily maybe more important than the knowledge that is in the question? So is it more dependent on the variety of factors such as upbringing, education, circumstances, than necessarily on knowledge itself? The we is the more important element. Who is asking, not necessarily how much knowledge that they do know. And how do people react to different questions from different groups? Are they more likely to disregard knowledge? If an authority figure asks a question, is that more reliable than someone who maybe has just relying on their own personal knowledge? You think about the way in which we react to authority and the questions that are asked by authority members. Some pitfalls to avoid with this title could be this idea of this simplistic kind of deduction, which would be like we need to know stuff before we ask questions, okay? Kind of a very simple argument, doesn't really draw out any of the complexity of the title. The question again specifies 2 areas of knowledge, so you need to make sure that you only use 2 areas of knowledge. You must include a discussion of dependence throughout, and that's really important when looking at comparing and contrasting different areas of knowledge. And you should try to look at the different we's. I think that's a really good area to focus on, and maybe something that is kind of a little bit, might be a little bit original in terms of your approach to the title. It's not necessarily a key term in the title, but if you investigate it further, who is the we? It's not really specified about who we is, okay? It could be we being the personal, it could be we being the shared. So some sample essay plans that I came up with for this title are here. So my first essay plan, the central knowledge question is, what role do questions have in the production of knowledge? You can see my thesis statement there, which is of the argument that the questions we ask do not depend solely on the amount of knowledge, but are based on who is asking them. So I kind of investigated this idea of the we. And then I drew out two kind of sub-knowledge questions from my central knowledge question. How important is personal knowledge in the development of questions? And does creation of knowledge require questions in the first place? And I looked at it from the human sciences perspective, and I looked at it from an indigenous knowledge systems perspective. And you can see my claims and counterclaims are attached to those two AOKs. My counterclaims are not direct opposition of my claims. That's really important that you don't just oppose what you've said in your claim. You need to be looking at a way in which it may be a limitation of your claim, or looking at a slightly alternative perspective, not an opposite perspective of what you've looked at in your claim. And most importantly, you need to make sure that you link it back to the title. So what I've said here is the questions we ask depend somewhat on the personal. However, production of knowledge is not solely dependent, as shared knowledge may be more valuable and reliable source of questions. So this is the idea of it does matter who is asking them, okay? Because if it's drawn from shared knowledge, then it's more likely to be valid and reliable according to my thesis statement. My second essay plan has the central knowledge question of under what circumstances do questions based on prior knowledge lead to stagnation of knowledge. So this is the idea of knowledge never really developing, that it pauses because we have the same questions being developed over and over and over again because we're never pushing into the unknown. My thesis statement, if questions solely depend on what we already know, this generates a cycle which may stagnate acquisition of knowledge. Exploring the unknown through questions utilizing aspects of prior knowledge may result in the development of unbiased, genuine, and groundbreaking knowledge. So questions looking at what we do not know are highly important, but they do depend somewhat on what we do already know as well. The two sub-questions that I've drawn from this is, what role does prior knowledge have in the development of reliable questions, and how does intuition drive the formation of questions? So unlike in the past essay plan, I have looked at my developments and looked at two areas of knowledge within each development itself. My first claim in development 1 is based on history, and my counterclaim is from natural sciences, and then in development 2, my claim is from the natural sciences, and then my counterclaim is from history. Again, most important, it's important to track your argument. You need to make sure that you have a really clear thesis statement in your introduction, and that you're continually coming back to that at the end of each development and each claim to see how it relates back to the title. So I can think about reconsidering assumptions in prior knowledge, maybe the basis for new interpretations. However, if we are too dependent on prior knowledge to develop questions, our knowledge of the world may fossilize. We necessarily might not develop any further. We might not necessarily break knowledge and have new discoveries and be able to learn more about the world. So I hope that gives you a bit of an idea about how you could approach this particular title. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch, and good luck with your essay plans.